welcome to that word chat again. It's so good to see you all. I hope, thank you for making it in. I understand that not everybody got the updated email for the location, but by now, hopefully you know where to find us. And if you're not here, sorry, but hopefully you'll be here soon. Today we have Fred Shapiro, who is editor of the new book, the new Yale Book of Quotations. I've loved books of quotation since I was shorter than I am now, since I was, I don't know, a teenager or before. I mean, I just remember reading the big book of quotations we had at home, and it's wonderful, inspiring stuff. And then as a copy editor, now I have a whole different take on the quotations. It seems that every other thing I read now, somebody wants to put in a quotation to illustrate the point of whatever they're writing about. And very often, you know, they're not right. They're completely bogus. Surprisingly often, people have the wrong, either the wrong quotation or the wrong attribution. So to talk about that today, we have Fred Shapiro. He's Associate Director for Collections and Special Projects at the Yale Law Library. And he's a leading contributor to the Oxford English Dictionary. So we'll ask him about that. But first, I want to ask him about this wonderful new book. So welcome very much, Fred.
Thank you for having me.
Good to meet you. So so this just came out, right? This is like a few weeks from publication. Yeah. And the last one was 2006. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So what's new in this one?
Well, first of all, obviously it has quotations since 2006, which are not necessarily a wonderful thing to have, because we have our discourse has become very debased in a lot of ways. So not every quote in my book is admirable or eloquent.
I did go to the T's fairly early in my looking through the book. Yeah.
Yes, there is someone in the T's who far and away has the most quotations, new quotations from the last edition, for better or worse. So there's that. But I think that the thing I'm most proud of is the research that's gone into this new edition, where for the first edition of the Yale Book of Quotations, I was able to make use of the proliferation which was beginning at that time, or it was already happening at that time, of historical databases of old newspapers and books and journals and legal documents, which enabled me to do research for a lot of entries beyond the imagination of traditional quotation compilers. But after 2006, since then, this proliferation of databases has become an explosion. So I was able to use it to more fully use the technology of online databases, historical online databases, to research famous quotations to death, really. A huge amount of research was possible. And I was able, even for entries that were already in the first edition that benefited from this kind of research, I was able to improve upon many of them. So this is, this is not your Bartlett's or your Oxford Dictionary of Quotations, in terms of which are both great books that I admire a lot, but in terms of research, I was able to go far beyond the existing quotation dictionaries. So I would say those are the two main changes from the first edition, are the new quotations and the improved research, enhanced
Right.
research.
So were there many corrections then to the,
Okay, well, I'm glad you said that because actually I was forgetting a third major
oh,
uh, thing that's new, which is that the first edition. I mean, I did get a lot of help from a lot of people for the first edition, but the first edition then inspired people around the world, and I got. I mean, I'll be honest. I thought that the first edition of the Yale Book of Quotations uh, could not be improved upon. That the kind of research I had done uh, was so terrific that no one could improve on it, and I was completely wrong about that because as soon as it appeared, I started getting a lot of emails and letters from around the world uh, pointing out, in some cases, errors, uh, and but in many other cases, improvements. I don't consider it an error if I found a famous quotation being used earlier than anyone ever had, and then someone else later found it even earlier. I think of that as an improvement. So I got
right.
a lot of improvements, and also suggestions of quotations that were not in the first edition. Now, I I'm very proud of not just the research, but the fact that I collected the famous quotations more thoroughly than any other book had. That it's very rarely that anyone has found a famous quotation that I left out, and I think, oh, how could I have forgotten that?
Oh, hmm,
Uh, but in some cases, there were older quotations that weren't included that were suggested to me that I added, uh, and the new quotations uh, benefited from this kind of crowdsourcing. So this is really
yeah,
uh, somewhat similar to the Oxford English Dictionary, which has relied heavily on contributions from many people. So so it's really the original kind of crowdsourcing was the Oxford English Dictionary,
right, right.
and
Yeah,
uh, the people that sent me quotations, uh, like the people that send quotations to the OED, are some of them are scholars, some of them are professors, uh, some of them are journalists, but most of them are just ordinary people that love quotations and were able to uh, do brilliant research in many cases uh, and make tremendous contributions. One outstanding example was someone named Garson O'Toole, which is actually a pseudonym.
right.
Uh, he was inspired by my first edition to create this magnificent website, quoteinvestigator.com, where he doesn't cover as many quotes as I do. I have about 13,000 quotes, but he has for hundreds and hundreds of quotations. He does extremely thorough research, more thorough for the ones that he selected than I usually have done, because I don't know if he has more time on his hands than I do, uh, but he's focusing on specific quotes that people have asked him about, and he has just done enormous discoveries, many of which I incorporated in my book.
Yeah. So you said he was inspired by the first Yale edition to start Quote Investigator?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, I didn't know that. Yeah, I rely on Quote Investigator. Um, I mean, that's a trusted source of, and he may not do, certainly it's not as broad, and there are plenty of times I want to quote and it's not covered in his research, but some of the more popular, well-known ones and some of the more popular misattributions um, are covered in there. And I and I know she uses pseudonym. Have you spoken with him and
Uh, I've never met him in person. I have never talked to him on the phone, I believe, but we've done a lot of emailing. Uh,
Yeah,
but yeah, I would like. He lives in Florida. Someday, I would like it if he is up in the Northeast and could drop into Connecticut, and I could treat him to a nice dinner.
yeah,
Because I really am, I'm in his debt tremendously because uh, for many quotations, many interesting, famous quotations, he has found better information than anyone else has.
right, right. And I think you also mentioned Ralph Keyes
Yes,
as somebody who,
Ralph Keyes is a real pioneer, and he inspired me to some extent. Ralph Keyes and Nigel Rees, who's a has a radio show in England. They were, I think, the pioneers who first uh, showed that there were certain deficiencies in Bartlett's quotations and the Oxford Dictionary of Quotations. So they had an impact on inspiring me to think about how a quotation dictionary could do more and be more accurate than the traditional quotation dictionaries.
right, right. And Ralph Keyes' book is the quote verifier quote.
Well, he
I've
had two.
forgotten.
One is nice guys finish was a nice guys finish last, uh, and the quote verifier. And he
Right.
really did a lot of research, and I think he, this a lot of back and forth on these things. I think he was inspired by me to uh, do research in online text collections. Uh, that I think that he learned
Hmm.
about that possibility from things that I had written.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I've got his book on my, I think I've got an Apple Books. I've got the ebook version of the quote verifier. Um, so I'm a fan also. And so can we talk about that? So a lot of the people who watch the show are editors, like I am. Um, and so if I want to verify a quote, and I do, I'll get a thing. There'll be a very nice quote um, that maybe came from, I mean, came from somebody Googling a topic and finding a quote and saying, great, that's it, and sticking it on there. If I want to go back and verify, what would you advise me to do to, where would I start and how would I find the truth about a quotation?
All right. Well, I guess there are two levels of verification. One is to actually go to the original source, not
Mm,
trust anyone other than the original source. And in the old days, to do that extensively, you had to be living in Washington D.C. or Cambridge, Massachusetts, or a place that has a really big library. But nowadays you can do a lot of it yourself by using Google Books, other freely available sources. You got to be careful of Google Books because they often mess up what we librarians call metadata, such as the date of what they're showing you. But
right.
but often, and then they generally just give snippets for things after 19, the mid 1920s. But you can often see the images of the actual book or other source on your screen. And if you have access to many of the online resources are unfortunately behind paywalls, and you have to subscribe to them. If you're fortunate enough to have access to things like ProQuest historical newspapers or
Mm,
newspapers.com, you can go often to the original source. But most people uh, may not choose to do that or may not have access to the sources. So I would say the second level of verification is to go to reliable quotation books, and the reliable ones are the New Yale Book of Quotations, the Oxford Dictionary of Quotations. Bartlett's Familiar Quotations is reasonably accurate, although they make more mistakes than the other two I mentioned. But you can generally trust the wording of the quotation and the sources that you get from those books. But you may want to, as an editor, copy editor, you may want to cite to indicate that you're citing to Bartlett's Familiar Quotations or my book or Oxford Dictionary of Quotations, rather than just citing the original source, unless you've actually seen a facsimile of the original source and can be sure of that.
Sure. So yeah, my process is I see quote, I immediately say, okay, I've got to check this out. It's probably wrong. And I'll do a search. I'll see if quote Investigator has covered the topic. And then I'll and I get paid by the hour, but I go to Google Books. I put in the date specific parameters of a search, and I look for the words or similar words, which that's the trick. Sometimes the words are slightly altered. I mean, that's the other thing we're verifying, whether the wording is accurate. And before I know it, 20 minutes have passed, and I'm still looking. I'm sort of backing up the date and rejecting some that are false positives, and then usually I'll say, well, if I can't find it before 1995, and there's a historical figure, it's probably inaccurate. And I honestly, I do all this, and I should probably simply put a little note in the margins that say, I have doubts about this quote, please verify it. But I can't, I obsess about it. So I have to keep digging and digging.
I guess what one tip which is very helpful is, well, two tips. One, if it says Mark Twain said it, the one thing you can be sure of is that Mark Twain didn't say it. And that's probably true of some other figures like Oscar Wilde, Abraham Lincoln. But the other thing is, if the quote just gives a person's name as the author with nothing else, it's probably phony. If it doesn't, if it says Allen Ginsberg and it gives the name of a specific quote, then it may very well be accurate. But if it just says Allen Ginsberg, it's probably not to be trusted. And of course, if it is someone like Mark Twain or Oscar Wilde, that's a particular red flag. The prevalence of misquotation is unbelievable. People say to me, "Oh, why do you have to have a quotation book? You have the internet. The internet is the ultimate source for quotations." And the internet has just proliferated these false quotations. And the tip-off is usually if it's just a person's name, and it's the Goodreads. Your viewers may be familiar with the Goodreads website, which is a great website in a lot of ways, but they have quotes, lots of quotes that people can like, and they have a list of the most liked quotes. It starts off with some quote, Oscar Wilde quote that has 120,000 likes, and I think the first 11 most popular quotes are all phony, and the Oscar Wilde quote is phony. I think the quote is, "Be yourself, because everyone else is already taken. And anyone that has a feel for the history of language or for Oscar Wilde knows it doesn't sound like anything Oscar Wilde would have said. It's too modern. So that's another tip off, is if it gives an older author, but it has a modern contemporary feel to it, it's probably erroneous.
Mhm. Yeah. So so Goodreads is one that we can say, and I've noticed that a lot of that, a lot of what's on Goodreads, I've seen that before. That I'll, first thing I'll do is I'll do a Google search for that particular quote, and very often Goodreads comes up, and I say, aha, nothing else. Are there other offenders in particular?
Well, just about any quotation website other than Quote Investigator or a few
Yeah.
others.
Well, I've so here the
Brainy
one I'm not.
quotes is
Yeah,
a bad one.
yeah, that's one I'm not sure. I used to I think of brainy quotes as something to avoid. I've noticed that they're I read their how they go about it, and they seem to be not. I mean, it's crowdsourced, but it's also supposedly edited, but probably not very well edited from what I gather.
I don't look at it that much
Yeah, I suppose you wouldn't go to those
for
sites.
obvious reasons, but it it's one of the more popular websites, but it's one of the more erroneous ones.
Right. So, and then another one that I do recommend and do use, but I have seen errors on it, is WikiQuotes. And you mentioned just having the quote without the source, and WikiQuotes usually has the source. And because it's got this, it's a wiki. It's got this people who are it's crowdsourced. People look at and verify, and they'll flag quotes that are not accurate or don't have a source.
I actually like WikiQuote. I didn't like it. I mean, Wikipedia, I initially didn't like because I thought,
Yeah.
what is this? Any person can change it? This is ridiculous. Imagine a medical entry
Right.
by someone who wasn't a physician. It's questionable. People might die from it. But uh, uh, WikiQuote, I didn't like at first because it just gave the names of people alleged to have said something rather than specific sources, specific books or articles. But they changed their rules at some point that I believe they require a specific source now. And I think it's actually pretty good. And I did use it to help me in compiling the new Yale Book of Quotation.
Oh, did you? Yeah. How would you how would you use it?
Well, if there was a quote, well, first of all, if I felt I needed to have more quotes from Martin Luther King or some other prominent person, I
Mhm.
know that they would have an article about with that person's quotes, and
Mhm.
it helped suggest to me quotes that I didn't have, or newer quotes that I could add. And then for specific quotes, if I'm having trouble tracking it down, I may try WikiQuote because they sometimes will come up with good sources that I hadn't had before.
Hmm. Okay. So you said one thing you're proud of is that you haven't seen too many. There weren't too many suggestions or quotes that really should have been there that you missed. Are there some of those in the new edition? That is there one or two that stand out that you think, oh gosh, how did I miss that the first time?
Uh, there are some. Uh, I don't, I don't keep a list of them, so I don't have them off the top of my head. There's not a lot of really famous quotes that I missed because for I worked on the first edition for 6 years, and for 6 years I walked around, and anytime any quote that I had ever heard and liked and remembered popped into my head. I would, put it in the book.
Right.
Over a course of 6 years, probably every quote I've ever heard that was any good passes through my mind at least once.
Interesting. Um, in this, you do say in the intro there are a lot of quotes. You did find a lot of quotes that were attributed to men and actually were written by women.
Yes, that's a real phenomenon. Uh, there,
Shocking, of course.
it's an example is uh, the most famous quote about freedom of speech. Uh, I uh, I disagree with what you say, but
The,
I will defend to the death your right to say it, which is usually
not
said
Voltaire.
so come from Voltaire, but actually it was a woman who wrote a book in 1907 called The Friends of Voltaire, and she was using that to describe Voltaire, to summarize Voltaire's thought, but it was her words. She was the one that originated that quote. Now, my big example, I don't, do you want me to take 5 minutes to explain a complex quote story?
Yes, absolutely. I think I think we
Right,
all would enjoy that.
my favorite example of a quote by a woman attributed to a prominent man, and it also happens to be a quote that I do like a lot, uh, is the Serenity Prayer, which
All right.
most of you probably uh, know that prayer. Uh, God, give me the courage to change the things I can change, the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, and the wisdom to know the difference. So this is a big quote. Alcoholics Anonymous, I believe, ends every meeting with reciting the Serenity Prayer. Many people believe that it's saved their lives. It's been used in beyond Alcoholics Anonymous in many ways. Uh, so this is usually attributed to the great theologian and political philosopher Reinhold Niebuhr. Uh, and Niebuhr's daughter, uh, Elizabeth Sifton, an eminent book editor, uh, she wrote an entire book called The Serenity Prayer. And the book revolves around a story she tells about how her father, that they used to summer in this bucolic town in Massachusetts, Heath, Massachusetts, and that he sat down one day in this bucolic Heath, Massachusetts, and wrote the Serenity Prayer, and then he used it in a church service, and at the end of the church service, someone came up to him and said, "That's a great prayer. Can I publish it in this book of prayers that I'm working on?" And Niebuhr supposedly said, "Take it. I have no further use for it." So I don't believe that any part of that story is true. And I've researched this for 20 years, and there's a professor at Rutgers University, William Fitzgerald, who's writing what will be a magnificent book about the Serenity Prayer. And he's been researching it a lot. And we've researched it more intensely than any quotation has ever been researched. And by searching in lots and lots of newspaper and book uh, sources, online sources, we have found hundreds. I mean, Elizabeth Sifton said it 1943, her father wrote this prayer. and we have found hundreds of early examples of the Serenity Prayer in newspapers and books, and many of them were before 1943. And this is, it's a checkered story, which some people think I'm crazy because of this story. But I think I'm just a seeker of the truth, and I follow it wherever it leads. So what happened was that I wrote a letter to the New York Times in 2003 saying, this is when they reviewed Elizabeth Sifton's book, and I said, well, Elizabeth Sifton says her father wrote in 1943, but if you search the New York Times historical newspapers, you will see they used to have a question and answer column. And in 1942, 1 year before 1943, people were writing and saying, who wrote this prayer? And Elizabeth Sifton did not like this one bit. And so we had, she was cordial at first, but then she really decided that I was a complete jerk and that I had no understanding of prayers and how they're disseminated, which is true. I'm not an expert on prayers, but I'm sure an expert on this one. And what I found, I kept on searching, and I found 7 quotations earlier than 1943 of the Serenity Prayer in print as far back as 1936. So her response is, no matter what I would find, she would say, oh, well, he must have written it earlier than I said he wrote it. But what happened was that I went to the New York Times when I found these 7 quotations, and they had a front page story, Yale researcher questions origination of Serenity Prayer. But then some other evidence came to light. Someone else did searching and found stuff that made it more plausible that it was Niebuhr. So I went to the New York Times and I said, this person has found some early evidence that might indicate that Niebuhr did originate it. So I felt it was. I told them it was less. It was more possible that he did write it. So they had a second front page story. Yale researcher eats crow, recants theory on Serenity Prayer. And then I kept searching because at this point I was really interested in finding really early examples of this. And I knew that anytime a newspaper was digitized by newspapers.com, it could have, if it was from the right time period, it could have the Serenity Prayer. So I found in 1933 a woman named Winifred Weigel, an official of the YWCA, used the Serenity Prayer. She didn't attribute it to Niebuhr. She didn't attribute it to anyone. And then the other early quotations, examples of the Serenity Prayer being used, were all from YWCA women. But Winifred Weigel was an associate of Niebuhr's. So I interpreted all this that, okay, well, this really clinches that Niebuhr did write it because she was an associate of his. She probably got it from him. But William Fitzgerald contacted me, and he said that all the evidence that I had found was subject to another interpretation, which was that Winifred Weigel did originate it. And he pointed out that the earliest association of people saying that Niebuhr used it, it was not a prayer. It was not a prayer, whereas Winifred Weigel used it as a prayer. And we did an incredible amount of research, and we could not find any actual use by Niebuhr until 1950, 17 years after Weigel used it. So if you look at all the early citations, there's a clear arc, a clear development from what Weigel wrote and using her language and through her YWCA circles. So if you look at the whole picture, I think it's pretty clear that she did originate it. I can't say that for certain because it's always possible that Niebuhr did write it obscurely and his daughter didn't know about it. But it doesn't. The detailed evidence doesn't make sense if you really examine it. So when Fitzgerald's book comes out, he'll go into all that detail, and the world can see it. But this is assuming that the Weigel theory is correct. This is another example of a quote originated by an unsung woman, but attributed to a famous man. And then there are many other examples that I give in my book of that.
Right. So, and everybody in the room understands that level of research and determination, I think, to get to the real bottom of that. Lost my train of thought. What was I going to ask about? I noticed one thing that was interesting was a lot of the quotes from women mentioned in here. Several of them were Peggy Noonan, speechwriter for Ronald Reagan and President George W. Bush. She originated "Read My Lips, No New Taxes." I believe she wrote the Challenger speech. But I wonder sometimes, is that difficult to say? It's written for a person, a man. The man speaks the words. It's maybe not something she would, as a speechwriter, say herself. Does it get muddy sometimes, and including in the Serenity Prayer. There is some sort of, there could be a collaborative thing by the sound of it that there was inspiration that went back and forth. So is it hard to kind of get to it must be sometimes there must be cases of quotes that are similar, and then somebody else has something, that maybe uses all the same words in a different order, and how do you know which is the original, which is the
right? Well, one famous quote is from the Bible: "There's nothing new under the sun," and there's a lot of truth to that. That the great thoughts are often simple thoughts, or proverbial thoughts that may be reinvented independently by more than one person. So it's complicated, and these are the things that I love in the research, are the complex ones. And yes, so there is a back and forth and a collaboration, and with the Serenity Prayer, there may have been some collaboration between Niebuhr and Weigel. That there's, as I said, there's nothing new under the sun. And in my book, I deal with this by having cross references, where I will often cross reference from one thought to a similar thought that was said by a different person, perhaps independently.
Somebody pointed out in the room that we didn't find the attribution or mention the attribution for the Voltaire quote. I was looking for it while you were talking in my book, and I think it was in the intro. I couldn't find it under Voltaire.
Well, it's under I didn't mention the woman's name because I was actually blanking out for a moment.
Oh, I did just found it. Evelyn Beatrice Hall.
Yeah, yes, right. Evelyn Beatrice Hall was a writer who wrote the 1907 book, uh, and it's uh, the as I said, that's one of the examples. But there in the introduction to the book, I listed a number of examples with the sources of prominent men and being misattributed for the words of
Right.
unsung women.
Right. Right. Yeah, it's fascinating to read. I mean, people, you need to read the front matter for any reference book because there's some gems in the beginning there. I noticed in the acknowledgments you mentioned how many people have come forward and contributed. I noticed Ben Zimmer was one you pointed out in particular, who's been on the show, and Jesse Scheidlauer, so a couple of lexicographers there. Ben is, I think the king of antedating whatever phrases and words. Is
Well, if you asked him, he would say someone else is the king. Uh,
who would he say is the king? Fred Shapiro?
yeah,
Well, in terms of the body of work, that's very impressive. But you also, so your biography says you're the foremost contributor to the OED. So what is it? What is that an official designation that?
well, it's in the OED newsletter in the beginning of this millennium. They said that our old friend Fred Shapiro has contributed something to virtually every entry in this book, and I have been a major contributor in a number of ways to them. I was the first one to suggest to them using online databases to find
Oh, really?
examples of word usage, and now that's what they do. That 90% of their work is searching online databases for examples of words and phrases. And then I've contributed. You mentioned antedatings, which is finding an earlier. The Oxford English Dictionary attempts to find the earliest printed occurrence they can find for every word and even every meaning of every word. And antedating means to find an earlier example than what they give us the first example. So I sent them well over 10,000 antedatings, including many really important terms.
Well
Now,
over 10,000.
yeah.
I've sent them well over 10, I think, or maybe about 10.
Well, I mean that's a lot. 10
Yeah, well, yeah.
uh, and it's through the Oxford English Dictionary that I became a quotation dictionary compiler. If you would you like me to tell the story of how I got into all this?
Absolutely, yes. What do we have? We got about 15 minutes. I don't see any questions from the room, so sure, yeah, I'm curious to know how does one get into this line of thinking and line of work?
All right, it's a long road. I mean, when I was about 10 years old, my father, who was not a literary type person, he was an engineer, but he came home one day with a book from the Strand used bookstore in New York City, and it uh, it was Bartlett's Quotations, And I really loved looking at Bartlett's quotations. I've always been a dilettante. Uh, I'm interested. My knowledge is not really that deep, but it's very wide. So I enjoyed the kind of browsing through Bartlett's and the sense of the little tidbits of history and literature that you can pick up by looking at Bartlett's quotations.
Yeah.
So that got me going on quotations. When I was in high school, an English teacher would have students before class started write favorite quotations on the blackboard, and that piqued my interest. When I was in college, I was an editor on an alternative student newspaper, and at the back of the back page of this newspaper, they had always had a quotation column with interesting popular quotations. So I took over. I didn't originate it, but I took over that column and did it for a couple of years. So then, also in college, I was on the Tiddlywinks team of my college. This was not
Seriously.
not your typical sports team. They had a humorous Tiddlywinks team, and I somehow became the official historian of the North American Tiddlywinks Association. So I thought, as part of my
It's
duty,
not in your resume. That really should be.
oh, that's a little embarrassing. Part of my duties, I thought, in this august position of official historian should be to research the origins of the game of Tiddlywinks. So at that point, I was in law school, actually, and I was the most indifferent law student ever at my law school. And instead of going to classes, and I'm not proud of this, it's not something to brag about, but I instead of going to class, I would haunt the stacks of the library at this college, at this university where I was at, and I found that in the basement they had a great section of old books about sports and games. So I thought, okay, well, I'll look up Tiddlywinks, and there was, and I found a number of old books that talked about Tiddlywinks. On the OED, the earliest example of the word Tiddlywinks was 1894, but I found various books talking about Tiddlywinks being before 1894. So I didn't really understand this because I thought the OED was perfect, that they somehow had the absolute coinage of every word, which, if you think about it, would be impossible. But what did I know? So I was trying to puzzle this out. A friend of mine said, well, they're working on a supplement to the Oxford English Dictionary. Why don't you write them a letter and tell them about these books you found with earlier mentions of Tiddlywinks? So I sent them a letter, and I knew that the OED was like a 100-year project, so I didn't expect to get an answer. I thought it might take years. But a few weeks later, I got a response from Oxford saying, well, thank you for the 7 examples you sent of early use of Tiddlywinks. Actually, 6 of them are no good because it's some later person claiming that Tiddlywinks was around before 1894, but we only go with actual documented evidence. But one of your quotes is good. It was from an Encyclopedia of Sports and Games from 1890. So there was a legitimate antedate. So I thought, well, this is maybe I could find other antedatings about sports and games. So I continued doing the sports and games research, continued neglecting my legal studies. And I found that I could do this for a lot of sports and games terms. And then I branched out into lots of different fields: politics, social sciences, popular culture, lots of different areas. And I found that that I could do this in a lot of areas. And I kept sending what were then little slips of paper. That was how they did it, 4 by 6 slips of paper, sending to Oxford. And I became their most prolific contributor. And then when later when these online databases emerged, I found I was the first person to use them for linguistic research, and uh, and that made it really much easier, much easier to do antidates. So now, if you give me any word, I can,
Yeah.
10 minutes make a good stab at finding when it was first used with the databases. Uh, so this kind of historical lexicographical research, uh, I got some publicity for it because William Safire had an on-language column in the New York Times, and I
Mhm.
got to corresponding with him, and he would whenever he had a historical question about something he was writing about, he would ask me, and I would send him information. So a book editor at Oxford University Press uh, knew about me from William Safire's column. So he invited me to lunch in New York, where I was working at the time. And I was a law librarian at this point. And he said, "Are you
So you
interested?"
did graduate from law school?
Did I
That's
graduate?
we're concerned about.
Yes, I did. I don't know how I did it. I actually even passed the bar exam, which was a miracle. I probably passed it by one point. Uh, so, but I my wife, who was a librarian, suggested that, uh, I practiced law a little bit, but I hated it. So she suggested the idea of being a law librarian, which I had never uh, heard of that concept, that people with law degrees sometimes became law librarians. Uh, so anyway, this editor from Oxford University Press asked me if I was interested in editing any kind of legal reference books. I said, well, there aren't any good legal quotation dictionaries. So I ended up editing the Oxford Dictionary of American Legal Quotations. And that was how I realized that Bartlett's and Oxford had shortcomings. And I realized that with online database searching, you could find better information about quotations, just as I had done for words. So to make the long story shorter, uh, eventually I had, after the legal quotation dictionary came out, I had another lunch with an editor from Yale University Press who asked me if I had any reference books I wanted to do. And I said, yes, I do, but it's too ambitious for you. You won't want to do it. He said, well, try me. And I said, I'd like to do a general quotation dictionary, to use the methods I used with the legal quotation dictionary to cover all fields, science, sports, popular music, movie quotations, politics, as well as literature and history. So that led to that was the Yale Book of Quotations. So it was very intertwined with the work I had done for the OED, and I think because I somewhat used these principles of the OED for the Yale Book of Quotations, the New Yale Book of Quotations, I think of them as the Oxford English Dictionary of Quotations.
Mm-hmm. So, so you started in college. Do you remember as a child, as a young person reading? Did you have a copy of Bartlett's at home?
Uh, well, that copy that my father had brought home from the Strand bookstore.
Oh, of course.
I didn't before then. I don't think I had ever even heard of a
Yeah.
quotation book.
Okay, we had an old one from the time I was tiny. I don't know where it came from, but I don't even remember which one it was now. But I think actually it's still in my mother's bookcase in Florida, all I'll have to check, see what the title is. We had 2 questions. We don't have a lot of time, but hopefully we can squeeze them both in from the room.
Yes. Our first question comes from Patty. If you want to unmute and ask.
Yeah, thanks. Hi, Fred. Thank you for the sheer volume of your work. It's just mind blowing to me. My question is, when were in the throes of meeting your deadlines for this new edition, what did you see when you closed your eyes at night? Did you see famous people like making speeches? I'm just curious how your mind handled that amount of data.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. My mind is not what it used to be. I mean, it was such a effort, and for some reason, the second one was more work than the first one. It shouldn't have been, but it was. It has to do with technical factors of updating the first edition. But yeah, no, I was going crazy, and I didn't really have a deadline. I mean, I had deadlines, but the first edition was very successful, so it gave me clout that, you know, whenever I was going to give it to them was when they would have to accept it. So I was lucky at that point. But I wanted to get it over with. I really wanted to meet their deadlines. But it really, you know, I was working on it for 15 years. And yeah, I don't know exactly what I saw at night when I closed my eyes, but quotations were always running through my head, and the keyword index is a big keyword index, and that was one of the things that was most difficult, and that haunted me quite a bit.
All right, we have one more question, I think.
We do. This one is from Dana. Dana, if you want to unmute and ask.
Hi, thanks. At the beginning of the program, Fred, you mentioned a whole bunch of resources that you've cited, and then you've mentioned some throughout. I'm wondering, I have a friend who loves including quotations in her email newsletters, and I would love to buy her a book. Can you limit a suggestion to a volume to purchase for her?
Well, yeah, certainly the new Yale Book of Quotations would be the one to purchase. Because I kind of absorbed the best of all the other quotation books that I did go through. I went through Bartlett's in Oxford to make sure, that was one way that I became comprehensive, was to make sure that I didn't miss any that they had included. I also got many that they did omit, very famous quotes that they omitted. But I intended my book to kind of replace all the other quotation books if there had to be one book that you wanted to have, or one book on a desert island.
Yeah, I don't know what their revision schedule is. I don't know if Bartlett's is being actively worked on, but you can say confidently that this is the superior right now book of quotations.
Yeah, I mean, well, I certainly feel that way.
So are you getting, now that the new editions come out, do you get a lot of emails and notes from people about changes? And is there anything that you've said, oh, I've got to definitely get that in the next edition already?
Well, it's still early days. It was just came out in September. So I'm starting, let's say I'm starting to get the kinds of communications that I got after the first edition.
Okay. All right. Well, other things I want to ask you about. I wanted to ask you about your day job, but we can maybe do that some other time. We're out of time, and I don't want to keep people late for dinner. So, or are you late? But I appreciate your time spending here with us. It's been an enjoyable hour. I think we're all a little bit geeked about what you do. and it's been great. So,
All right, thank you.
Um,
Thanks for the questions.
yeah. We'll be back either in 2 weeks or 3 weeks. We're not quite sure yet, but we will have another show in November, and look forward to seeing you all then. And thanks for coming. And we will see you next time.